Excellent. I'm technologically challenged. I'm one of the old guys that always had 12 o'clock blinking on the VCR back in the day. So uh, how I wound up in technology is another question altogether. I'd like to thank you all for stopping by my talk this morning. My name is Stephen Kirby. I'm a systems/security engineer for R&S Solutions, a small logistics company out of Jackson, Tennessee. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how we're using the PCI DSS security framework as a general purpose framework for controlling our security environment. Give you a little bit about me. I'm a 30-year IT vet, started in the late 1980s. And for me, BSidesGVL is a little bit of a homecoming. I spent about 12 years in Athens, Georgia at the University of Georgia. And for all the Clemson fans, better luck next year. I gravitated to security early on. Started out with Novell NetWare and moved into a dozen or so flavors of Unix. And I even do Windows now, generally under an assumed name. I do hold multiple security certifications. And that's always important because, you know, if you're not certified, you don't know anything, right? And as I mentioned, I am currently a systems engineer for R&S Solutions out of Jackson, Tennessee. A few caveats are in order before we get too far gone into this. Number one, I make no claim to be a PCI DSS expert. My current employer is not subject to PCI compliance requirements, and so we don't do this in air quotes for real. Don't assume that anything I say matches the PCI's interpretation of their standard. They know better than I do. And if you're doing this in order to process payment cards, don't let me lead you astray. We could be a little bit more flexible than the PCI is going to be when it comes time to do an audit. I would also stress that the opinions expressed here are my own, and they're not those of any employer, past or present. Okay, a high-level discussion of what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes would include 4 major points. Number one, just so we start from a common ground, we're going to talk about what is a security framework. We'll talk about some of the most popular frameworks and see if I can answer a question, why would I want to use yet another one? Aren't there enough other good ones out there? I'll talk some about how we chose to adapt PCI DSS at R&S Solutions, and we'll bring about some key takeaways. I will emphasize that my perspective at R&S is that of a very small business. I can tell you that as of last week, we had 104 Office 365 licenses, and a good number of those were going to contractors and to third-party vendors that were using them for purposes other than their primary email. We are a small shop, and that definitely has an impact on anything that I talk about. If you have to put it in perspective, our security team consists primarily of me, myself, and I, and not even all of that. I have responsibility for managing Linux and Windows systems and general networking issues and anything else that crops up. We have 2 other engineers one other engineer and our manager on the technical end. The other engineer has no formal responsibility for security at all. And my manager is spread thin as it is. He has a good security mind, and I'm very fortunate to have him. That's one of the reasons why I'm there. But we don't have probably a single FTE devoted to security full time. If you have a large organization, some of these things may not be as beneficial, but for us, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today were critical because the alternative really was having no formal security program at all. Okay, an introduction to security frameworks. What is a security framework? Well, a security framework is a high-level strategy for protecting information assets. It provides guidelines and best practices. Frameworks provide guidance on what to do, but they don't tell you how to do it. Typically, a framework will say, use strong encryption. They will not say, use AES 256. There will probably be some understanding that you would use an industry standard, and AE 256 definitely would qualify. DES probably does not. But that's not going to be specified in the framework. It will be specified in some of the supporting documentation. There's several examples of popular general security frameworks. I'm going to mention three. ISO 27001, or actually the entire ISO 27000 series. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or the CSF, and the CIS Critical Security Controls. The first one that I'll mention is ISO 27001, or as I mentioned, the 27000 series. And it's part of an international set of standards. It was originally developed as a British standard back, I believe, in the 1990s. I have to go back and check on the date, but it's grown in popularity, particularly in Europe, in the last 15, 20 years. One of the difficulties or obstacles that you face with ISO is that the official standards documents have to be purchased, and they're not cheap. There are a number of them, and they are, given our budget, they were prohibitively expensive. One of the good things about the 27000 series, it is very structured and very formal. So if you are a large organization with the resources to throw at it, it allows you to develop a very thorough framework. The ISO 27000 series assumes an information security management system is already in place. So it's not really, there are some startup costs associated with trying to implement this standard. The main benefit from ISO 27001 and other associated frameworks is getting certified by an approved third party. And that costs money, lots of it. It's an expensive process to go through. And as I mentioned, with our small staff and small budget, it never really was a serious contender. The other thing worth noting is that it's not as popular in the United States as elsewhere. As I mentioned on the slide, see also soccer and Formula One. This is very popular internationally, not so much here in the US. Here in the US, probably the big dog would be the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF. It's also very detailed. The special publication 800-171R2 is the short form of the standard, designed for non-governmental agencies. The original framework was designed for federal government agencies and contractors, and for them, compliance is mandatory. The short form there I mentioned is 113 pages with extensive links to external documents. So it's quite detailed. Most recently revised in February of this year. One of the problems that we ran into looking at it is that it doesn't weight or prioritize individual controls quite the same way that PCI DSS does, and we'll see what I mean by that in a moment. It allows quite a bit of room for interpretation, and it has to, because it's intended to be a one-size-fits-all type of framework. And it can be a little, I can tell you from having looked at it, that if you're a small shop, it could be a little bit daunting if dedicated resources are small or non-existent. One of the other popular security frameworks here in the US would be the CIS top controls. They're now called just the top controls because the number has changed. It began life as the SANS top 20 and then became known as the CIS top 20. It's now the CIS top 18 controls because in version 8 of the framework released in May of this year, the number was reduced. I think that combine some of the elements. One of the benefits of the top controls framework is that it does help prioritize individual controls. For example, if you're a small organization, there's an implementation. They've introduced the idea of implementation groups, and there are three levels of those. Implementation group 1 is aimed at small organizations. Implementation group 3 would probably be applicable to a Fortune 5 or something like that. It's easy to overlook the CIS controls because 18 to 20 controls doesn't sound like much. The reality is it's much more detailed than it sounds. There are a whole lot of subsections under each individual control. And if we had not gone with PCI DSS, this probably would have been the framework that I tried to implement. The problem with CIS is that it doesn't have the kind of supporting tools that we're going to look at here in a minute that PCI makes available for folks who are trying to implement their framework in order to comply with payment card processing requirements. The way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. And the reason that I would give for why we decided to go with PCI DSS as a general non-binding framework is that it made it easier for us to get the program off the ground, up and running. We started in May of this year, really, and we are already in the process of completing our first self-assessment. I'm not sure I could have pulled that off if I tried to go through and implement some of the other more detailed standards. PCI DSS, or the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, is another security control, and compliance is mandatory for organizations that process payment cards, credit and debit card transactions. It's not intended for use as a general purpose security framework, but it can be adapted for that use very easily. In fact, if you want to know the presentation in a nutshell, download some of the PCI tools, do a global find and replace, find cardholder data, replace with sensitive data, and you're done. Then all you have to do is go implement it. The idea of doing that was presented in a CISSP training course I took, a year or so ago, taught by Kevin Henry, who basically developed the training materials for ISC squared for the CISSP. I thought it sounded like an interesting idea, so that was the first thought that popped into my head when I was trying to find a framework that we could that would work for us in a small company. PCI does produce a spreadsheet that we'll see in a moment called the Prioritized Approach Tool, and I found that to be very useful. It helps decide which controls need to be implemented first. It actually is color coded with here, so you can look at a glance and say, okay, I need to do this group first, this group second, and this group 6 down here we'll put off to the very end. It makes it easy to track and document implementation. As you proceed through the spreadsheet and review the controls, there are sections to indicate, yes, we did this, no, we didn't, here's what we have to do, excuse me, here's our plan going forward. And I think that is a key advantage of PCI DSS over other for security frameworks. For example, CIS Top 20. You could develop the same sort of documentation for any of the controls that I mentioned earlier, but you would have to go out and do that for yourself. With PCI, you can download it from their document library, make a few appropriate customizations, and have a full suite of documentation ready to begin in a matter of days. A few of the things that I like about the PCI DSS are that the controls are focused and detailed. They provide structure but not constraints. Again, they don't specify that you have to use a particular level of encryption, let's say, but they do specify that it needs to be an industry standard. And I would want to document what that standard I'm following is in the spreadsheet as I work through it. The controls are adaptable for organizations with small IT staffs because at the end of the day, PCI is targeted at everybody who processes credit cards or debit cards. So they will have to, they have to be adaptable to small mom and pop grocery and drug stores, for example. Those folks won't necessarily have to provide the same level of documentation that a larger organization would, say a credit card clearinghouse, but they have to be able to provide some information or find someone who can provide it for them. The concepts are easy to explain to non-technical personnel. One of the easiest sales jobs I've ever done was having to explain to our leadership that our goal is to process our sensitive information with the same level of care that we would process if we were dealing with credit card transactions. That intuitively made sense to them. Because so many organizations are familiar with PCI DSS, it's easy to communicate what we're doing to other organizations that ask about our security policies. And as I mentioned, the biggest advantage that we have found is that extensive documentation is available directly from PCI DSS at no charge. And that's certainly a welcome benefit for an organization with a tight security budget. This is an example of the prioritized approach spreadsheet, and you can see there a whole list of subordinate requirements under the major requirement: install and maintain a firewall configuration. And you have prioritized lists 1 through 6. Level 1 being stop what you're doing and do this first. 2 is what you do after that, and then there are an additional 6 levels of priority. You can indicate it. Are you done? Yes or no. If you're not, explain why. And then provide a little bit of explanation out in the additional columns. And you have documented the current status of your security program in a very detailed fashion once you've finished processing the spreadsheet. PCI uses a 3-pronged approach, basically. The first stage is to assess and identify all locations where sensitive data might be stored, taking an inventory of assets, and analyzing those for vulnerabilities that could expose sensitive data. The next step is to repair, find the vulnerabilities and fix them. And then the third stage would be to document your assessment and your remediation details, and at that point you're ready to begin the process again. So this is a continual cycle: assess, repair, report, and we are now at the report stage for our first pass through. There's some things that are useful to keep in mind when you're trying to apply PCI DSS. The most important is that unless you're processing payment card data, there's no need to stick to the absolute letter of PCI DSS. You're not going to get penalized if you don't. You probably will be less secure, but so long as you can say you're keeping in the spirit, that probably is going to be good enough. For example, there's no need to use third party for external vulnerability scans, penetration tests, or audits. You can do that in-house so long as you're not trying to process payment cards, and we have done so. We do conduct external vulnerability scans against all of our environments using a third-party vendor that we contracted with for a very small charge. I was quite pleased with that. If we were doing this for real, we'd have to use an approved scanning vendor, and the cost would have gone up substantially. Informal self-assessment can take the place of an audit, and we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. And the PCI DSS does offer guidance for performing such an assessment. PCI DSS requires payment card information to be deleted as soon as there's no longer a business need to retain it. That's good practice, and I definitely would do that. But there are some things that our management wants to keep around longer than I wish they would. We're not failing to be in compliance because of that. So it does give you flexibility. Whether or not that flexibility is a good thing is subject to debate. There's no deadline to achieve compliance. We do not have a sword hanging over our head that if we don't get our assessment done by 31 December, that we're going to no longer be able to process payment cards, because we're not doing that. This is just us using this framework to as a form of guidance. And there's no penalty for falling out of compliance. If in your next cycle you detect that something is no longer working, it's not the end of the world. You need to fix it, but it doesn't put your ability to do business at any risk. It may be something you need to address as soon as possible, maybe today or tomorrow, but you're not at a risk of having your ability to do business suspended. There's some sections of PCI DSS that may not apply. For example, we don't develop applications in-house, and there are entire chunks of some of the security controls that don't apply to us. Those were my favorite sections, because I sailed through those. Some sections are aimed at service providers, and those are outside entities that could impact security of cardholder data. You won't need to necessarily worry about those. Important points to keep in mind would be that provisions are not restricted to information that is stored electronically. As difficult as it is for us in what is now almost a digital age to remember, there's still a lot of paper records out there. And those paper records need to be secured or securely disposed of too. PCI does take that into account. PCI envisions the secure environment to be a subset of the company network. But when you're processing sensitive data as opposed to payment card data, it may not be possible to simply isolate off into one segment of the network. Your accounting department may need to be able to talk to HR, which may need to be able to talk to the CEO's office and the CFO. So you may wind up with a larger shared environment. And that means that you're going to need to look at some of the controls that we would normally apply to a segmented environment and apply them possibly to a larger segment of your larger spread of your network. There are a few common pitfalls that I've discovered in reading and in our own experience for organizations that are attempting to comply either to the letter or into the spirit with PCI DSS. The bugaboo for every security professional I've ever known has been failing to change default passwords on network devices, routers, switches, IoT, printers. Multifunction printers are very useful as penetration testing tools, because most of the default passwords you can find through a Google or a search engine, and very few. It seems to be common practice amongst printer service technicians to keep those set to the same thing for convenience sake. And there have been several conference presentations on how to set up a reverse shell on the printer and use them to capture credentials as people come to log into the printer to print something. Poorly written web apps that allow SQL injections. And SQL injections, is hard to believe, are still an issue, but they still make the OWASP top 10 on a regular basis. SQL injections or exposing a database to the public internet directly. I mean, it's hard to believe that those are still problems, but they are. And then another big issue would be exposing sensitive data to insecure networks or endpoints. The most obvious example would be BYOD devices that are, allowed to connect directly to the company network, or are somehow able to gain access to the company network through guest wireless because that wireless network isn't properly segmented. I show my age here. Sack It To Me reminds me of the late 1960s comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh In. One of the by phrases or catchphrases on that show was "Sock It To Me." So if you remember Laugh In, you know where this came from, and if not, well, I'm old. Organizations that process payment cards are required to submit responses to an annual self-assessment questionnaire. And the SAQ, or self-assessment questionnaire, is a standardized form that can be downloaded from the PCI DSS document library. We're working with the questionnaire for Class D merchants, and we found it very, very useful. The one problem that I did run into was that the form as it is delivered by PCI is a PDF file. So I spent the better part of about 3 days converting that into a spreadsheet similar to the one that we looked at earlier. Once I got there, that greatly simplified the process of doing our self-assessment, which we recently just completed. With modifications, that self-assessment questionnaire provides a great template for an annual review of an organization's security practices. I'm using it to prepare an end-of-the-year report for our ownership and management, which is something that they've never had before. One thing that I will say is that you should not fear failing your first assessment, particularly if you're starting from ground zero in a small shop that has not had an active security program before. You're not going to get everything done in the first year. What you can do is map out a roadmap for what needs to be done and maybe come up with an improvement plan to get the top priorities taken care of in the next 6 to 8 months. Since we're not using PCI for compliance purposes, our objective is a little bit different than the standard. We simply need to identify what we need to do, what we're actually doing, both what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. And we need to identify what we're not doing but need to do in the future, and then develop a strategy to close those gaps. The final section of the SAQ document is attestation of compliance, or AOC, the other AOC. AOC doesn't assume or require full compliance even for environments that are in scope for PCI DSS. What it does necessarily, what it does is provide an action plan for non-compliant requirements and a timetable for completing those requirements. And it can be massaged to generate a summary of your current security practices that you can share with customers and potential customers. And in fact, that's exactly what we intend to do. Some key takeaways from this, things that you're going to need to look at especially carefully if you do decide to follow PCI DSS. One is network protection. You're going to need to make sure you've got firewalls in all the right places and that your network is properly segmented. As has been mentioned elsewhere in other talks this morning, there's no such thing as a security professional who doesn't believe in network segmentation. You'll need to be careful with passwords and default settings. Make sure that none of your devices are using the default passwords, that users are choosing secure passwords because we're stuck with them for the time being. That I would emphasize making sure that none of your passwords have been involved in a data breach, because the definition of what constitutes a secure password has changed considerably in the last 5 or 10 years. And make sure that all of the default settings all of the settings on your network devices and PCs are configured correctly. You'll need to make sure that data at rest is properly encrypted, that data in transit is properly encrypted, that you have malware protection and is kept updated, that systems are hardened, that they're patched, and that unnecessary services have been removed. Make sure that each user has their own account and that A password is assigned to the account, and that you can track exactly who has done what in as much as possible. You need to restrict physical access to sensitive data. Make sure that your main server shouldn't be on a PC sitting under somebody's desk. It's been a while, but I have seen that. You need to restrict physical access to sensitive data. For example, backup tapes. If anyone's still backing up to tape, that's almost as good as having access to the data itself. It needs to be secured, it needs to be encrypted, and it needs to be stored securely. You'll need to have logging and log management set up, some form of central log management or storage, for example, a SIEM. You'll need vulnerability management practice both internally and externally. You'll need to conduct regular risk assessment and documentation, which turns out to be easier said than done. We're still wrestling with that ourselves. And you'll need to perform regular reviews, at least annually, and follow any major change to your infrastructure. In summary, security frameworks are a useful roadmap for developing a security program. Depending upon available resources, some more established frameworks may not be viable for smaller organizations. My advice would be to find a framework that you like and stick with it. The PCI DSS was developed to secure payment card data, but it can be leveraged to create a viable security framework for both small and medium-sized organizations. I thank you very much for coming by my talk. I think we're done a little bit early. If we have questions, I'll be glad to take them, and I will provide a link to the slide deck in the chat in case anybody wants it. Thank you. And let's see.
Great, Stephen. And I know my experience with this is Mark. I worked for a company that had nine other companies that I oversaw, and 2 of them had the PCI compliance requirement, and they had a contract in place to do the external scanning, and I thought it was fabulous. And so I got with the same company and put a contract in place to scan the other 7 companies. Now, it was a totally separate agreement, so it wouldn't mess up their results. But it was just so nice to be able to get the same type of information easily. It was so easy for me to do that.
Yes, that's wonderful. We actually went out and evaluated some companies that provide this as a service, not necessarily for PCI, and found one that allows us to do, they're actually selling OpenVAS, which again, probably wouldn't have been my first choice, but the price was right. And it does allow us to at least guarantee that, for example, I can promise you that we don't have RDP running on any of our public IPs. That was my first big concern when I got there. And those are the things that you need to check for. It helps to make sure that you have things buttoned up as well as you do, because I think if you ask any systems administrator anywhere in the world, all of them would deny that they have RDP port 389, 3389 exposed to the internet. And we know obviously that has not been the case.
And another issue that you encounter is when you tell somebody they need to do something, they're like, well, that's just your opinion. We've been doing it this other way forever. And when you have some type of standard to stand behind you and go, well, no, this is the best practice according to this industry standard. This is why you need to do it. You tend to get more traction if it's an industry standard you're trying to implement versus what could be considered your opinion.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we adopted a framework developed in our program, because it was easier to sell to management. They intuitively understood when we said we're handling all of our sensitive data the way we would handle credit card data. It made sense to them. I don't know if I had said, well, we're doing this because the government, the NIST, this agency and the federal government said to do it. I don't know that it would have registered quite as solidly. And that's going to be an issue probably more for smaller organizations like ours than it might be for some place that is a little bit larger and is more in tune with government requirements.